Episode 9 with John O'Keefe. Hey everybody, you're listening to the Never Forsaken podcast, looking at the lives of the outcasts, the seekers, the never forsakens, those in or out of the local church, and passionate about Christ. The show is broadcast weekly, and show notes and more information can be found at neverforsakenpodcast.com. I'm your host, John Robinson. Let's get into the show. Okay, welcome podcast listeners to another episode of Never Forsaken Podcast. My guest today is John O'Keefe. He's the author of Naked Jesus and the lead pastor at Crossbridge Christian Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. John, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. This is going to be fun.
Absolutely. John, I've really enjoyed reading the book, and I think a lot of our backgrounds are very similar, so I'm just very curious about your background. Were you raised in the church, and how did you become involved in ministry?
I wasn't raised in the church. Had nothing to do with the church when I was a kid, really. I mean, the typical, I was born in New York City, and so the typical little kid New Yorker, grandma brought me to church every once in a while. So I would go to, Christmas and Easter kind of thing. And it always smelled weird. It smelled like old people. So I never really liked to go, but I went because grandma would buy a suit, and so I would have to go, that kind of thing. So I wasn't raised in a church, had no real church upbringing, everything. I was living in Las Vegas at the time, went to UNLV, did my undergraduate work at UNLV. And by the way, Guy Fieri and I went to the same school and went at the same time. And he don't look at all like he did when he was in school, and I don't look at all like I did when I was in school.
Time gets us all.
Yeah, it's just one of the funny things of life is that we know each other, but probably couldn't recognize each other if we were sitting, from our old pictures, kind of thing.
That's funny.
But yeah, he's a good guy. But so I went to UNLV and I graduated and got married and had a daughter and stuff. And my wife was my sister and my brother-in-law were my own personal Peter and Paul. So every time I would turn around, they would go to a family event, they would beat us over the head with the Bible and try to beat us into Jesus. And probably about 2 years after graduation or so, she stopped. And I thought, well, maybe she left the church. Maybe she got out of that, that cult thing. And turns out she went to a different church, and they had a whole different attitude towards a lot of things. So I got to talking to her, and I went to her church, and the next thing you know, I was being baptized, and a couple of years later, I was in ministry. I was in New Jersey working for the Girl Scouts. I used to be a director of development and public relations, and I went to work for the Girl Scouts in New Jersey. And when I was in New Jersey, started going to a little Methodist church, and the guy was a pastor during the weekends and a truck driver during the week. And he looked at me one day after being there for a year or so. He just looked at me and he said, "So when are you going to start seminary?" And I said, I'm not. And he said, "You're going to be a pastor?" And I said, "Maybe you think so, but I don't." And he goes, "No, I think God thinks so too." And I've been fighting it for a couple of years, that feeling of being in ministry. And just put all kinds of roadblocks up and said, "Okay, God, if you want me to do this, I can't do it without a house, can't do it without income, can't do it with my bills the way they are and everything." And next thing you know, I was able to pay off all my bills. Got a scholarship to Drew to get my master's. Wound up becoming an associate pastor at a church with a parsonage and an income. And so I was like, all right, God, you removed all the barriers. I can't fight it. And so I went into ministry. Went back after I graduated. I did a year, and I always say I did a year because it sounds like a prison term.
Right.
I did a year with a group called the Primitive Methodists. And exactly what they are. They're primitive and Methodist. And so we were there and decided to just go back to the West Coast, go back to Nevada, go back to Las Vegas. So we went back to Las Vegas, and from that point on, I've just been rejuvenating churches or planting dying churches. And then for the past 15 years, 18 years, I've been doing that. And then this came up, this opportunity here in Lincoln, Nebraska came up, and I thought, well, I just got done trying to rejuvenate a church in Oklahoma that didn't work. So I not necessarily really want to go back to the Midwest. And somehow they got my paperwork, and they shouldn't have. And God leads. And the next thing you know, I'm in Lincoln, Nebraska. and absolutely loving it. Absolutely loving it.
That sounds great, John. So at some point you're coming through the church, and it seems you had a pretty radical transformation, and kind of, I hate to use the Christianese, but on fire for God. And at what point do you start to become disillusioned? Because reading through the book and through your writings, you have this somewhat of a disillusionment of maybe the way that you thought church would be compared to what church really was. Could you kind of explain that a bit?
Yeah, I think I became pretty disillusioned pretty quickly. It's sort of like seeing the emperor without any clothes. All of a sudden, I went from just sitting in the pew and just listening and just being part of hearing the conversation, to all of a sudden being involved in the conversation and being involved in the behind the curtains aspect, to mix metaphors of Oz. And I started realizing that the church was just a bunch of people trying to do business and not really do God's business, wanting to do earthly business. How much money can we raise? How much, how many people can we get into the pews? How many, how do we increase offerings and stuff? And some of the theology wasn't making sense to me as I was reading scripture and hearing what they were saying. It was kind of like, what's going on? And then I fell into this group of people, Mike Muzak, Doug Pageant, and at the time, Mark Driscoll, that just sort of made me start thinking about things differently. So back when it was called the postmodern church, we weren't the emerging church at the time, we were the postmodern church. I started to write under the name Punk Monkey, and really kind of just lashed out. I mean, there was a lot of anger and a lot of viciousness in my writing when I first started writing, because I was so frustrated that the church wasn't doing what God wanted it to do, that it was just doing what the accountant wanted it to do, or the finance person wanted it to do, or the administrative board wanted it to do. And I got angry and I started pulling away. And early there was this time where I was in ministry and I wasn't in ministry. I was in ministry and I wasn't in ministry, because I kept pulling away from it, thinking I can't do it. And then finally I just realized the only way to change it, or the only way to make it anything different, is to not just keep pulling away and just writing viciously, but to say, okay, I'm going to get involved and I'm going to write on the ideas of what I think needs to change and what I think needs to occur. And so that's sort of how it all started for me. It was this idea that I just needed to be involved in the process, and not only talking about what I wanted to do, and not only talking about what I thought, but also teaching from the front on that, and also writing on that, and then also living that, and saying this is what we have to be.
And then you have to you go from a point of being angry in your writing and getting this kind of like heretic, mindset where people will think, well, you're not in line, you're not good with God, you're not right with God, and you're coming against the church. And I know that can be a hard thing to deal with. And then kind of coming from that and into where your writing now is more seasoned with grace, and I would say probably more the right way to come against the Kool-Aid type of church teaching. Would you agree?
Oh, totally. Yeah, I think I've gone from being a spirit of anger to a spirit of grace, hopefully a spirit of forgiveness that says, it's okay. It's kind of like if you and I differ doctrinally on something, or if you and I differ theologically on something, I'm like, it's all good. I'm okay with that. I don't agree with it. I would think something different. But, okay. You can be who you want to be and do what you want to do. But I'm going to go over here and do what I think is right, and I'm going to do that. And, if you want to come with me to see what we're doing, then that's fine. And I find that when I was writing with anger, people were pulling back a little bit. I mean, I had a group of followers, but they were people who were just as angry and just as mean and just as vindictive, and they started slowly changing, and I started slowly changing. And it was this idea that we could actually make more of a difference in the world if we just showed people what it meant to be a missional, emerging, postmodern, non-evangelical Christian, and how did that work for us? And then them see it in us, and then go, it's okay if you don't have the same doctrinal stance as we do, because you're still wanting to see Jesus in the community, and you're wanting to see people who are people of faith being in the community.
I can understand that, kind of coming out of my angry period as well. And I was afraid that starting the podcast, the people who do actually know me, close to me, would say, well, he's bringing all these people on because he's angry. He's trying to get people on his side. In your writing Naked Jesus, how did you come about to write Naked Jesus? Were you still in that angry period, or you're kind of past that?
No, I think I was past it. What I wanted to do when I first started to write the Naked Jesus, and I think I said it in the book, that I had one almost complete draft done, and I had to trash it. Just had to throw it away, and it was funny because when I decided I had to trash it, somehow my computer crashed, and I wound up losing it anyway, because I wanted to compare Jesus to a businessman. I wanted to compare Jesus to these different people, put different clothes on Jesus, and so finally I just said, you know what, for me that's not going to work. It needed to be more of a, let's take the clothes off Jesus. Let's just see him who he is and just go from there, and just realize that it's not our clothes that we have to put on him. It's our taking off our clothes. We have to stand naked before Jesus also. And how do we go about that process? I think Naked Jesus, I think the first book I ever wrote was called Boneyard, and I think that was pretty, I don't want to say mean-spirited, but I think that there was some shots in there that shouldn't have been taken, but they were taken, and I own them, so it's the way it works. But Naked Jesus, I think I just wanted to see the Christ. I didn't want to see all the stuff and the fluff and the circumstances that we put around it. I just wanted to see who Jesus was, and realize that he's not Democrat, he's not Republican, he's not independent, he's not. He's just all these things. He's not radical. He's a revolutionary. And the difference for me between a radical and a revolutionary is a radical is someone who fights from the inside, and a revolutionary is someone who fights from the outside. And I think Jesus fought from the outside. Yeah. And I'm certain that there are going to be some evangelicals who say, no, he fought from the inside. He accepted the laws, and he accepted all this stuff. And in my reading and in my understanding of the words that he says and how that works in first century culture, is he was pretty revolutionary. He was outside the mainstream and outside the norms of what you would consider to be a good little rabbi.
Right. So a lot of times, you talk about he's not this, he's not that. A lot of times our Christianity is shaped by our perceptions of the world around us. And you get into this concept in the book of neuronets. Could you talk about that a little? Explain what the neuronets are, and how is our Christianity formed by what we see around us?
Well, the neuronet is this idea that we have that when we see something, we record it, and therefore we base everything on that, what we see or what we hear. And the idea of remapping those, and the idea of saying that we need to just get rid of all that, is to say that culture doesn't matter. What our culture is does not matter. It doesn't matter what our cultural background is, what our understanding of cultural background is. None of that matters. And I look at what's going on right now with Black Lives Matter and with some other issues that are happening within our communities and with our culture, is that people are going, yes, Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. And it's like, you know what? That's the assumption of Black Lives Matter. But right now, let's focus on Black Lives Matter and not focus on all lives matter. I've had several people ask me why I not as involved in Black Lives Matter as some others. And it's like, well, look at me. I'm a white guy. So right. If I get involved in Black Lives Matter to the point of saying, this is what we got to do, this is how we have to approach it, well, I'm just bringing my privilege into it, and it's not going to work. And so I have to step back and say, okay, what do you want me to do? It's not what I want you to do, it's what you want me to do. And it's having that, relearning that neuronet, relearning those cultural differences that exist, and saying, you know what, they don't really the culture doesn't matter at all. What matters is, what is Jesus telling us? And Jesus telling us that all lives matter, but right now, Black lives matter because they're the ones being hurt the most right at this particular point in time. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, Asian lives matter. Hispanic lives matter. It's just this idea that we start getting in our head that all lives matter, but let's start with Black lives.
Do you think, John, that the church has to listen more than they talk?
I think everybody has to listen more than they talk.
I agree.
I think we tend to go into conversations wanting to get our point across, and not just listening to the question, and not just listening to the conversation, and letting the conversation go where it goes. A perfect example of that is with our political system right now. I mean, if you ask a political person, it doesn't matter who they are, with the exception of the one that I want to vote for, and he's a good guy. I
think we have the same guy in mind.
Yeah, I think we do. But it's this, you ask them a question about something, and they give you an answer that has absolutely nothing to do with what you asked them, but they're trying to get their talking points across. And it's like, did you even listen to me? Did you even hear what I had to say? And I think as a people, we're getting frustrated with that. And I think it's turning its head up in the church. It's turning its head up in our culture. It's turning its head up in our political systems, because I think we're at a point where we're saying, you're not hearing my voice. All you're hearing is your talking point and how you want to get that across. And that's not going to work for us. And I think so a lot of people are getting very disillusioned by it. And I think it's a rewiring of that neuronet. It's that rewiring of our thought patterns and how we do things, and how we think about things, and how we come about to make decisions. I think we've gotten to the point in our culture and in our society where just hearing the monotonous political garbage, and even in the church, when we ask a question of our pastor, or we ask a question of someone in the church in leadership, or even someone in the church who's not in leadership, just happens to be a member of the congregation who's drank the Kool-Aid, you're not getting an answer to your question. You're getting you're getting the corporate answer. You're getting what they were told is the right answer, as opposed to them thinking for themselves and saying, "Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense."
Well, and sometimes is it okay if we don't have all the answers?
Oh, totally. If you want to look at somebody and say, if somebody asks you a question and you can honestly look at them and say, "I don't know," I think we're okay with that. I think that if we demand that we have all the answers, that the Bible gives us all the answers, or that we can bring out all the answers from reading a set of scripture, I think we missed the point of what Jesus was trying to tell us about life, and about how we get along together, and about how we connect and how we communicate.
But you get into the idea in the book about the American Jesus, and it's like you get this American Jesus kind of pushed on us from day one, and that we're supposed to be this rugged American male with, we have to figure out our lives. We have to design this little path of school, a career, family, 2 cars, wife, dog. And you get into the concept of, when you speak about American Jesus, you say that Jesus isn't really the hope for America, but he's the hope for the individual. And he's not a magic genie that's just going to change America. That the central idea behind us being a follower of Jesus is that we change, and when that happens, the world, in fact, changes. Yeah.
Because I think if we have this idea of the social gospel. We're going to go out and change things, and we're going to create laws that make things more just. Okay, so let's take that and carry it to its conclusion. I'm going to make laws based upon my theological understanding, and I'm going to make the world more just because of that. What's the difference between that and a Republican saying, I'm going to make laws where this is illegal because it's my morality and everything? And so we're no different than they are at that point in time. When people who want to have a social gospel sit back and want to change the laws so that people are a little bit more freer, if you will. Well, what difference is that than changing the law into something else? Because it's still the law, and that's not going to change anything. Because now you're telling me, I have to do something that's not that's illegal if you don't. Well, my argument is, or the way I read Scripture is that Jesus changes me, and therefore I'm changed, and then I need to pass that on to somebody else. I believe all human life is sacred. I believe all human life is sacred. I don't care when it is. I don't care where it is. I just believe all human life is sacred. I actually believe all life is sacred. So now we can get into the debate of should you be a vegetarian. We can get into the debate of capital punishment. We can get into the debate of abortion. But I'm not going to create laws that change those things. I'm not going to say that now I'm going to pass a law that says you can't eat meat. I'm not going to pass a law that says there can be no executions. I'm going to pass a law that says there can be no abortions. What I'm going to say is my heart was changed. I believe all human life is sacred. I don't care if the law says I can do this or not do this. This is what I'm going to do. And I think that's where the neuronet sort of gets shifted, where we no longer are thinking in the terms of what everybody is telling us. When we learn math, we learn one. We learn what is half of 11. I did this in one of my other books. What is half of 11? Well, half of 11 is 5.5. Well, yeah, if you want to do it that way, but can half of 11 also be a 1 and a 1? Can half of 11 be ELV? And then the other half? Can half of 11 be X and a 1? So half of 11 can be a lot of things, but we're taught half of anything is when you divide it by 2. Well, that's the neuronet that's solid with us, and so therefore every time we make a decision, we make a decision based upon what our past experiences were. And what we need to do is pull back from that and say, you know what, this is a different situation, and this is a different time, even if it's been 2 years, 5 years, whatever. I need to look at this differently, and how do we solve this problem, and how do we attack this issue, But I think when we say that our way is the only way, I think we misunderstand it. God's way is the only way. We don't necessarily know 100% what is God's way. All we can do is say, this is what I believe God's way is. And then there's going to be some who agree with you and some who disagree with you. But you don't. It's not the fighting of it. It's where Jesus is sitting there with his disciples, and his disciples come up to him and say, we found a group on the other side of this hill that are teaching in your name, and they're casting out demons in your name, but we stopped them. And Jesus says, why? And he says, well, because they're not part of us. And then Jesus looks at him and says, they are. If they're doing it in my name, and they're doing it the way they're teaching what I'm teaching, they're part of us. Just because they haven't been here walking with me and walking with you and learning from you, that doesn't mean anything. And so we need to get that in our mind and get that in our idea that it's okay to be different, and it's okay to have those different feelings, but I'm not going to force my thoughts and my rules and my regulations on you. So it's the individual that changes, and once a number of individuals change, the culture naturally changes. It doesn't matter what the laws are, the culture shifts, and I think that's where we need to be.
So on the opposite of American Jesus is like super liberal Jesus, and the Jesus that
Soviet Jesus.
Yes. Everything's okay, everything's good, God understands me, and perhaps that's my own neuronet looking at that. Is that something that we need to address? And even you're a pastor of a church, how do you address extreme liberalism, I suppose, or is that even something that needs to be addressed? Does our neuronet have to change in regards to liberalism?
We're an amazing congregation, the church I serve. We're about 350 and growing. We have conservatives, we have ultra-conservatives, and we have very liberal people in the congregation. We have people who stand against gay marriage, and yet we have gay couples in our church. And it's the idea that they're like, I disagree with that. I disagree too. Okay, let's go have a beer. And they go and have, so it's like they can disagree without having to say, well, I can't associate with you because you're you don't think like I do. I think what we need to do in the church is just realize that there are going to be people that see things differently than we do, and that's okay, and we should not have to freak out about that, demand that they don't. And I think we need to just realize that there are going to be people that have positions that are diametrically opposed to what we think is right. And then how do we deal with that? I think we deal with that in a way that just says, you know what? I disagree with you, but I'm called to love you. So that doesn't mean I treat you badly. That doesn't mean I insult you. That doesn't mean I demand that you believe what I believe. And we go from there. Now, if somebody comes to me and says, my brother, for example, he's like, well, I like parts of Christianity, so I take parts of Christianity. I like parts of Buddhism, so I take parts of Buddhism. I like parts of Islam, so I take parts of Islam. I like parts of Hindu, so I take parts of Hinduism. Okay. Now what do you believe? Because the reality of the situation is if you like parts of one and parts of another, then you're not really getting committed to one. And if you're not going to be committed to one, what happens is the minute something occurs that alters or challenges your position on a particular theological stance, you're not challenged by that. You're just going to go, okay, well, the Buddhists say this, so I'll take that. You know what I mean? And I'll just leave that Christian part aside. Then that's one of the ones I won't accept. I think if you decide that you're going to be a follower of the teachings of Christ, I think if you say to yourself, that's what I'm going to do, that's where I feel the most comfortable, then you have to process those in your heart. You have to process those in your life and be challenged by them. I think that a lot of liberalism and a lot of ultra-liberalism and a lot of ultra-conservatism are designed specifically so that you can't be challenged. You just either anything goes or you just follow the rules. So it's either totally gray or it's totally black and white. And those are either or situations, and I'm a both and kind of guy. And so I think that in our faith and when I read Christianity and when I read the words of Christ, there are things that I say are absolutes, for a lack of a better term, are so concrete that you can't change it. Love is so concrete, we can't change it. We can't alter it. We can't redefine it. We can't push it aside. We can't say, well, you can only love the cute and cuddly, and you can't love the ugly. So we have to sit back and say, okay, if I'm going to be a follower of Christ, then I have to live by the teachings of love. I have to live by the teachings of peace. I have to live by the teachings of forgiveness. And no matter how that challenges me, and no matter how that alters my emotions dealing with the culture, I still have to follow that teaching. So I have to say to myself, that's where God wants me to be, because that's where I feel I'm at. And then go from there. I mean, I before I became a Christian, I looked into Islam, I looked into Buddhism, I looked into Hindu, I looked into Krishna, I looked into all those faiths, and I found that I could follow Jesus because he challenged me. Some of the other faiths allowed me to just sort of pick and choose what I wanted to, whatever the mood struck me as. And yet Christianity allowed me to say, you know what, I need to alter my existence. I need to alter who I am. I need to rework my neuronet and really sit back and say, okay, I need to change the world around me by changing me. I remember when I was younger, I was taking a class in Aikido. I was working up in the belts in Aikido. And my instructor once, I got frustrated with something, and my instructor looked at me once and he said, you need to understand, you control your environment. Your environment does not control you. And I thought, so that kind of changed my views on a lot of things, and I bring that into my Christianity, where I say that I don't change Christianity. Christianity changes me. And what I find with most people that are what we would call heretics, or what we would call emerging, or whatever the label we want to place upon people, is the idea that what we actually have is a faith that's changing us. And what I'm finding with a lot of other people within the more evangelical sides of the church is that they have a faith that they can change. And they see just the opposite. They see that we're just wishy-washy and whatever the case may be. But the people that I know that are part of the emerging conversation, Steve Knight, Rich McCullen, I mean, just all these guys that I know, and these women that I know that are just just totally and completely absorbed into this idea of emerging and changing faith, is the idea that the faith is changing them. They're not changing the faith, and they're really looking at things differently because they're reading the words of Christ, and they're saying, okay, that's great. It's not necessarily what somebody else is writing about, but this is what I think. And so you read another book and you start reading all this stuff about rules and regulations and how you must live, and then you read Christ and you're going, wait a minute, and you read Paul, and you read even Paul. When you read those people, you go, wow, law doesn't matter. It's not that I follow this particular tradition or this particular line. It's how God is speaking to me at this moment, and that's the most important part.
Well, and that's not always comfortable. I mean, sometimes
very uncomfortable.
Yeah, people want a Jesus that is like, loving Jesus. He makes me feel good, and I want to go to church and leave church happy and have a blessed week. But the reality is that oftentimes Jesus ticks us off, and his words were designed for that. I mean, it kind of gets you angry sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think I said it in the Naked Jesus. If Jesus isn't pissing you off, you're not following Jesus.
Right.
It's just that simple. I mean, if Jesus is not making your life uncomfortable, making your decisions uncomfortable, making your walk on this planet uncomfortable, then you're not following him. You're following you. You're doing the things that you like to do. You're doing the things that you want to do, and you're trying to make them Christian. You're trying to make them Christian,
So what's the best way for us, John, to move forward as a church and to kind of in a nutshell, I know it's a lifelong process, but really quick, what's the best way for us to change our neuronets? How do we change our perception of the world around us and kind of move forward as the church that we should be?
I always hearing a lot lately about submission. Submitting to your husband, submitting to your church leaders, submitting to your whatever. You submit. And the word has gotten so nasty and so mean because we look at it from the point of the abuser and not the point of the abused. I don't have any problem with submitting. I want to submit to God. I want to submit to Christ. That's who I submit to. I don't submit to the leaders. I don't submit to a committee. I don't submit to a board. I don't submit to anybody else. I submit specifically to Christ and specifically to God himself. And how do I go from there is the question I ask myself. So I think we need to learn to submit. And I think that learning to submit allows us to change. Because we start to see the world the way we want to see it and how we want to view it. And I think when we submit, we start seeing the world the way God wants us to see it and the way God wants us to view it. And that alters who we are, and that shifts our neuronet, and that shifts our standings in the world. And we become different people because of that, because we allow ourselves to submit. It's when we don't submit, I think, we have the biggest problems. I think that's why, you read about some of these leaders that are falling, these leaders of large churches that are all of a sudden resigning and stuff because they've had an affair, they've become over abusive, or abusive, period. There's no over abusive, you're just abusive. Because I don't think that they understand the concept of submit. I don't think that they're willing to say, I'm going to submit to this. To say, you know what, I'm in a relationship with a woman and we're married, we're whatever you want to call it, that I have to be willing in my heart to submit to God in such a way that our relationship grows and becomes something of value. But that's also the relationship between you and I. That's the relationship between me and the person across the street. That's the relationship to everybody, is that we learn to submit. And when we learn to submit, I think we learn to do things like help others because it's no longer us. It's no longer centered on who I am and what I want and what's going to be beneficial to me. We learn how to forgive others because it's no longer what do I feel like and what is my world. How come you can't do this the way I want? So I think the learning to submit part is extremely important. I think once we learn to submit in a proper way of submission, not in an abusive relationship, I think we learn to see the world in a different way.
That's powerful words, John. I think that's a great mandate for the church. And so what's next for you? Are you working on any projects now, or are you just focused on pastoring?
Kind of focused on pastoring right now. Have an idea for a book in my head. Rob wrote a book a little while ago called Love Wins. I don't know if you ever heard of it. But I'm kind of I'm toying with the idea of writing something to the idea of forgiveness wins. So, and how forgiveness changes our lives and how forgiveness works with the psychological and with the physical and just everything about forgiveness and how important forgiveness is. So I'm kind of toying with the idea of starting something like that.
Well, I look forward to it, John. And again, I'm just about finished with the book. I'm looking forward to finishing it. I think it was a great book. It's The Naked Jesus by John O'Keefe. I'll put the link up on the pages as well, on the website and whatnot, and hopefully some people pick that up, and at least we can get the conversation started about this naked Jesus, about the real Jesus and not the Jesus that we've kind of formed our own perception of. And John, thank you for coming on the show today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you for asking. I appreciate it. This was fun. I enjoyed it.
Outstanding, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you, brother.